As a terrible hoarder with a short attention span, I am always looking for the next set of minis I can 3D print. There are just so many cool ones to look through, and I can just spend hours going through and undressing them with my eyes, or painting them with my eyes. Guess? I don't really know where that was. So, for today's episode I found an amazing sculptor for tree spirit type things, which I intend to incorporate into a kind of feral wood elves army. That sculptor is Clay Beast Creations, and I'll link them below. I contacted them and they kindly sent over some STLs, but I also bought a few because I'm greedy. So for this video I'll attempt to go from downloading the STLs through to a small army that's tabletop ready. Let's do this! So, as I was waiting to download, I had a look on the OPR Army Forge, as I intend to use these in Age of Fantasy regiments. I know you can create your own lists now, and I might do that at some point, but for now I'm happy to just try and fit them into the current Wood Elves army. I settled on this list here, where the Wood Singer is the Eternal Leader with Caster. She seems pretty magic-y. Those basic tree dudes are obviously just treemen with heavy claws. Then I have these treemen hunters. They have tough 3, so obviously they're meant to be a bit bigger. That works perfectly for those kind of fairy flying things. And then the big stag dude is a tree giant. So yeah, that's the list. One of those guys, 1 of those guys, 10 of those guys, 3 of those guys. So with a vague idea of a list, I knew how many of each I needed and got printing. First things first, how are the pre-supports? Anytime you download STLs from a creator for the first time, it's always a gamble, and there are many I've had to go and support myself. Let me tell you, these minis all printed with no issues whatsoever. I just threw them in and got to printing. Every time I was kind of thinking they've gone well so far, my luck's gonna run out, but nope, all good. Okay, I did have one issue, but that was entirely my fault. I left the print on and forgot to check how much resin was in the vat. I know, what a stupid thing to happen, but I'd suspect most of us have done this once or twice. Go on, admit it, you can be honest here. Next, I went on Critter, my illustration program of choice, and planned out a colour scheme. Normally I'd experiment as I went, but because I want to hit the ground running in a speed paint technique and have a small army to paint, I don't really have time for that. My first thought was a silver kind of birch type wood with warm, dark leaves. I played around with this for a bit just to see how the colours went together, and I was quite happy with it. Then I checked out a kind of chestnut colour wood with pale blue glowing parts, although I couldn't really figure out a good colour for the leaves. So then I went for this golden kind of wood with magenta and blue leaves. I think this could look decent and would stand out, but perhaps it was a bit busy on the eyes with all the high saturation. I showed these to Kat for opinions and she said it looks like he's wearing a Christmas jumper, and yeah, can't disagree there. So I settled on my original idea and I played around with that a bit more until I ended up with this, and I think it should look decent. The smaller guys come as one part. This is great for not having to mess around gluing bits together, although it does reduce the customizability. The counter to that is that these guys come with just a good variety of poses, so there's no particular need for posability. The only other concern with that is if a print goes slightly wrong, it can be useful to have individual parts so you can reprint what you need, like just one arm goes wrong so you print off that arm again instead of needing to print a whole new mini. This is another minor gripe though. As previously mentioned, the supports are really good, so this wasn't really needed. So I stuck everything down and got to basing. For the regular dudes, I used the tried and true technique of PVA glue, sprinkling some larger sand then filling in with fine sand. For the 2 big boys I wanted more interest on the base, so I went out to my local park and grabbed a load of small sticks, stones and bark. I spent some time arranging these and gluing them down. I want these guys to look like they're between a kind of thick forest and a more open plain nearby, kind of a variation. So I vary these up. Some get a load of overgrowth and roots and all that kind of stuff, while others mostly get a few small rocks and then they'll get grass later on. This is an army I'm starting up and want to build quickly, so I'll be focusing on some speed painting techniques. So, first of all, after priming with Incubi Darkness and realising I was running out, I finished with Chaos Black. With this scheme, I'm going to try and create some depth early on by using colours as shades. To start this, I choose a few colours that are far apart on the colour wheel that will act as light bouncing around. There's a load of colour theory about this we don't really need to get into, where light bounces off other surfaces before the figure, so colours are always kind of influenced by the surrounding items and environments. But basically we can replicate that without knowing all that shit. I pick a low angle colour, which will be a foresty green colour, then use warmer colours as contrast to that. That's because where the sun is bouncing around it would tend to create these kind of warmer colours. I use red in the midpoints, yellow from above and green from below. I only use this as a very loose rule however, and sometimes do the red and yellow in different amounts, sometimes one from one side, one from another rather than mid and high, and sometimes use the green to cover the lower portion of the mini, where I sometimes use it on the entire mini just from a downwards angle. Basically just play around, you'll get some cool effects. Now, to cover the majority of the colour scheme, I'm going to dry brush, always a classic speed paint technique and also a good way to check out the detail on the sculpts. A cold white grey should make a good first pass, getting close to that silvery colour I'm going for. I tried to get this on the majority of the model as I'll highlight it in the next step. So next I use ice yellow. I'm trying to stick to the idea that the shadows are colder colours while the highlights will be warm because the sun is hitting them. If I need any extreme highlights, this also leaves me a pure white to use, although at this point I haven't decided whether it will be needed. And that is a huge part of this done, that's the main colour. So next I block out the other main colour, the dark red. For speed painting, contrasts are always useful, and going directly over the previous steps should help the contrast and colour variation. On some parts I'm a bit careful, but on others I just cover areas to get that colour filled in. With the bigger fairy type dudes, I'm going to play around with the areas until I kind of settle on something. On the wings I'm going to use a feathering technique. To do this, you simply put your contrast on the area you want it, immediately clean your brush and wipe the excess water, then come back in and use that water to kind of extend and fade the colour out. For the main final colour, I'll use Cassandra Yellow Wash. Some of the leaves I'd left on purpose in the previous step, and now I go in and yellow them up. I do this random and varied as I want to get that ununiform look. These guys are vengeful spirits who have animated a bunch of branches. I don't think they have a dress code. I also use this for the parts of the fairies that looked more like skin, just to differentiate them from the other unit. At this point I take out Basilicanum Grey and start painting claws, although this doesn't really make enough difference to be a worthwhile step, so I just kind of stop after a little while. I go back to yellow here, as I'm thinking my two big models could do with just a bit more interest. I pick out some of the loose branches with the yellow, and I'm quite happy with the added depth of detail this is creating. I'll stick with these two for a bit longer and bring out some of the vibrancy on the Stag Boy's glorious mane by stippling orange and then yellow onto those leaves. I do this in a patchy random fashion to make it look all autumnal and varied. I'll also do this on the regular leaves just dotted around those big models just to make them stand out more. Now to move on to the small details that will just make the models pop a bit more. The eyes for the basic dudes are simple. I just fill them in white and then I go back to my Cassandra yellow to shade. Finally, a smaller dot of white is applied just to give the eyes a glowy look. Because I haven't used a pure white anywhere else, this will stand out and look really bright. Next, I'll use ice yellow as a light dry brush on the yellow parts. This is to create some highlight areas and especially pick out a bit more detail on the wings. This will be the majority of the detail as I'm using speed painting as an excuse to do no edge highlighting, baby! Okay, so I did some actual edge highlighting on the two big boys. This is just to make sure the detail is clear and looks interesting. I'm still feeling the big boys look a little too basic, so I start playing around with ways to make them stand out. First things first, I want the silver woody parts to look brighter, so I dry brush with pure white. I'm doing this kind of heavy, but also only on upwards facing areas. The reason is I want to create this kind of shimmery effect where the brights are really bright and the recesses are really dark. Now I decide to add more colour variation to the yellow parts, so I take a nice muted green, Sons of Horus green, and thin it down to almost a wash consistency. I put this over the lower and centre parts of the leaves, and then in the shaded areas of the large parts. This boosts the vibrancy and just gives it that bit more visual interest. Sticking with this idea, I use a pre-mixed airbrush purple to create the same effect for the white parts. I focus on the head crest of the wood singer and the white antlers on the stag. I go quite heavy on this and even use 2 thin coats blue glaze to deepen the shading to lean further into the shimmery effect. I finish off the details here by using Gore Gruntifer on the pipes. Right, with the majority of my minis done, I fill in the bases to get an idea of what it'll look like. I fill them in with 2 thin coats Ancient Forest. I then do a light overbrush with burnt sand by loading up the brush and then wiping away maybe 60% of the paint. Then simply brush over the texture to pick out the raised parts. I use Storm Vermin Fur to pick out the rocks, keeping it fast and loose to keep the time down. We're still speed painting, baby. Next, a coat of Agrax Earthshade to shade the brown parts. I avoid the grey of the rocks, but again I'm not too particular. At this step I did avoid the branches, which I then go over with Seraphim Sepia to create a varied tone. After this step I'll do a quick dry brush with medium sea grey on the rocks. Okay, so the boring part of these bases done, I'm going to move on to the effects that will really make these models pop. So, first of all, some grass tufts. I'll go around putting these wherever I feel like before moving on to the loose grass. I'm using 2 different types here. The second is fairly straightforward, but this one seems to tangle up and be for like clumps or something. The best way I found to use them is to put the PVA down, shove a huge ball on top and then just leave it there. When the glue's dried, pick that apart until just the bottom layer remains. As I said near the start, I varied these up, so some models would be in thick grass while others would be in more forest detritus. Speaking of that, here's the easy way I got it. Every time I have a cup of tea, which is pretty much always as a self-respecting British person, I set the tea bags aside to dry. I wanted even more variations, so I also raided the herbs and spices. I brewed these in boiling water just in case anything would kind of leach into the PVA glue, although I have no idea if this was actually necessary. Once I have a collection of dried tiny leafy bits, I bake these at 100 degrees Celsius for an hour to make sure there's no bacteria. Then I just collect them into a pot and there we go, easy forest detritus. Now I apply these as usual, spreading some PVA glue where I want them and sprinkling them on. With everything basically done, I'm still feeling these 2 centerpieces are kind of missing something. I try out some Flesh Terrors red in the carvings, but I wasn't too sold on this. It kind of just blends in with the rest of the red. So I tried Talisar blue on the wood singer and I actually think it looks quite cool. So then I mix in some moot green with some express medium for the stag, and I think these just add a bit more interest to those models, kind of help them stand out a bit. Okay, that wasn't too difficult or time consuming in the end, and I'm pretty happy with the force. Let's have a look at the end result. I'm really happy with this scheme. That white and red just really bounce off each other so nicely. And yeah, they turned out amazingly. There will be another part to this where I paint out some actual wood elves, so don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see that in a couple of weeks. Also, consider checking out my Ko-fi and Patreon if you want to be as majestic as the stag's antlers. Right, thanks for watching, bye!